Thank you for listening to the Apocalypse Payload. We are building content for the world of EchoThis at echothis.com. This will help us build out more stories and immersive training for computer forensics, OSINT, and cybersecurity in the future. Thank you. Act 3. Collapse of Explanation. Chapter 6. Shelter in Place. The alert did not begin as a sound so much as an invasion. Every speaker in the basement chirped at once. The handheld on the shelf, the weather radio by the sink, the battered phone Barnes had left face down beside the keyboard, the old municipal wall intercom in the outer corridor that had not spoken in months and had therefore chosen the perfect moment to recover its civic purpose. Even the cheap emergency receiver Ed kept sealed in plastic near the medkit woke up and screamed. The same hard electronic tone came from above them too, bleeding faintly through concrete and pipework from apartments, offices, cars, stalled in the wet street, whatever phones and radios and emergency devices still held enough battery to obey the state. Barnes flinched so hard his knee hit the underside of the desk. Ed was already moving. The tone pulsed again, a shrill, mechanized animal sound designed by some committee of disaster psychologists to bypass argument and go straight for the spinal cord. Rain scratched at the basement window. The inverter whined in complaint. The room, their temporary country of cables and evidence and stale coffee, seemed to fill with a government voice before the voice itself even arrived. Barnes snapped upright and grabbed the audio capture workflow out of reflex. He dragged one recorder hot, then another, patched the emergency receiver into the laptop input, armed a quick capture, and hit record on 2 local devices because catastrophe loved the exact moment a single recording chain failed. "You're welcome, future historians," he muttered. The voice came through the tone at last, flat, measured, female, the kind of official calm that existed only because the person reading knew panic would travel just fine without help. "This is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. A civil emergency has been declared for Aviary City metropolitan sectors and surrounding intake corridors. Residents are instructed to shelter in place immediately. Do not approach symptomatic individuals. Avoid all physical contact, including restraint, unless necessary to preserve life. Reports of extreme aggression, biting, and infectious exposure are under active review. If you are indoors, remain indoors. Secure all doors and windows. Do not attempt unauthorized travel to hospitals, clinics, or public aid points unless directed by emergency personnel." The voice paused, not enough to breathe, just enough to let the city hear itself being addressed. Then it continued. "If an individual exhibits fever, confusion, non-responsiveness followed by sudden agitation or assaultive behavior, create distance. Do not handle blood or saliva without protection. Await further instruction. Emergency services are operating under surge conditions. Shelter in place. Further guidance to follow." The tone returned once, then died. For a second, the room held its breath. Barnes stared at the waveform climbing across the audio capture like a seismograph proving the state had finally developed a pulse. Ed, halfway to the shelf, said, "Well." Barnes copied the recording into a fresh evidence folder without answering. Official language had finally crawled into public view. Not all the way, not honestly, but enough to confirm what the memo in the scanner and the private channels had been circling for hours. Biting, infectious exposure, sudden agitation after non-responsiveness. Public language now, not hidden in redactions and internal euphemism. Too late, his thoughts supplied. Too polished, his anger added. He tagged the file. FEMA_public_alert_initial_capture_01. The weather radio crackled. The phone on the desk vibrated with the delayed text version of the same alert. The outer corridor speaker gave a dying cough, then repeated the tone in shorter bursts as if the building itself had become hysterical. Ed picked up the phone, read the screen, and looked over at Barnes. "They said bites out loud." Infectious exposure. Also yes. You want to say it." Barnes opened the emergency text message, screenshotted it, preserved the metadata, forwarded a local copy into the case folder, and only then spoke. "I want to say they have arrived at the truth by way of cowardice." That sounded rehearsed. I've had practice being disappointed in institutions. Another alert rolled across the local municipal site Barnes had opened in a secure browser. Same core guidance, but with different wording. Shelter in place. Avoid aggressive febrile individuals. Do not attempt home transport of ill persons. Contact emergency services only if safe to do so. He made a disgusted sound in his throat. Ed heard it. "What? Look at the downgrade." Ed came around the desk. Barnes pointed from the federal alert to the municipal relay. FEMA says biting and infectious exposure. City says aggressive febrile individuals. One version is late, the other is dishonest. Ed read it once, then once more. City still trying to keep the floor under people. "No," Barnes said. "City is trying to keep liability under language." He archived both versions side by side. This was what he knew already from the memo, the thread, and the video fragment. Institutions never moved cleanly from concealment to honesty. They moved in layers, each preserving its own dignity as long as possible. The memo had said direct fluid contact and biting. The thread had said clinical veil and public misclassification. The ambulance bay clip had shown a body no one sane should have trusted to remain still. Now, the public alert admitted bites and risk, but not the dead getting back up, not the observational discipline, not the fact that the whole city had already spent crucial hours naming a weapon after its most comforting symptoms. He opened a comparison file. Public message drift. Active. Internal memo. Acute febrile neurological presentation clusters / direct fluid contact / biting / respiratory isolation insufficient. Thread. Clinical veil / response lag / payload. Confirmed active / public channels remain misclassified. Public alert, aggression, biting, infectious exposure, shelter in place. Municipal relay, aggressive febrile individuals / home transport, discouraged / reduced explicitness. He stared at the lines. There it was, the whole arc in miniature. Private panic, hostile confidence, public half-truth. Institutions were finally speaking. They were still behind the event. The hallway speaker in the outer corridor chirped again. A different voice now. Local, rushed, male, reading from text he did not trust. Building occupants are advised to remain inside their units and avoid hallway congregation. Emergency access routes must remain clear. Do not open shared entry points to unknown persons without visual confirmation. The last phrase snagged on the way out, like the man reading it had only understood, halfway through, that unknown persons was no longer a category anybody could use comfortably. Ed moved to the hallway camera monitor and brought the feed full screen. The corridor outside the basement remained empty for now. Sickly fluorescent spill from the stairwell. Water stain on the ceiling like a map of somewhere unlucky. The far end of the hall where shadow always looked a little more organized than it should. Nothing moving, nothing good about the nothing either. Barnes tagged the building announcement and saved a local audio capture. "You're recording the whole collapse in triplicate," Ed said. "Yes." "Why?" Barnes didn't look up from the keyboard. "Because once people start lying in public, sequence matters more than ever. That one's going in your memoir. My memoir will be mostly profanity and receipts." Ed accepted that with a small grunt and went to the shelf, where he started moving supplies into categories with the cold serenity of a man sorting ammunition by future regret. The basement seemed smaller after the alert, as if official acknowledgement had tightened the concrete around them. The room was the same: ruggedized laptop, salvaged second screen, drive cases, water bricks, med kits, the burned mug, the map on the wall, the shelves lined with the architecture of caution. but it no longer felt like a private place where two men watched the city worsen through filters of analysis and denial. The government had reached into it now. So had the city above. The room had become a listening post inside a declared event. Barnes pulled emergency feeds from every direction he could still reach. Federal channel, city channel, transit authority, hospital-facing public notices, neighborhood relays, ad hoc volunteer boards, police band summaries, low-trust survivor groups already breeding certainty from almost nothing. He built a live monitor pane and watched language mutate by the minute. Shelter in place became remain indoors. Do not approach symptomatic individuals became maintain distance from violent or confused persons. Do not handle blood or saliva disappeared entirely from one repost and turned into avoid direct exposure in another. He clipped, preserved, hashed, compared. The differences mattered. Not because wording solved outbreaks, God knew language had killed as many cities as disease, but because the seams told him where understanding lived, where fear lived, and where concealment remained policy. On one local board, somebody had already posted a screenshot of the FEMA alert with the caption, "They mean zombies," but with grant funding, Barnes archived it. Then another post below it, "My brother says the hospital is calling it assaultive flu," archived that too. Then a longer one from a woman in the West Blocks, begging people not to repeat bite rumors, because her father was sick and frightened, and not every fever meant the end of civilization. Barnes sat back hard enough to make the chair complain. There it was again, public confusion not as accident, but habitat. He thought of Null Harvest's line, "Initial presentation will not trigger correct classification. That is the advantage." Ed came over carrying 2 masks and the small med kit. He set both on the desk beside the keyboard. "That's your reminder," he said. Barnes looked up. "Of." "That breathing and bleeding continue to matter more than your note structure." "That is unhelpfully correct. It's my brand." He took one of the masks and hung it around his neck rather than wearing it. Too soon. Too much strain in the basement air if he sealed up now, but close enough to matter. The med kit stayed within reach. Another siren cut across the rain above them, then another farther east, then a third that stopped so abruptly Barnes could almost hear the decision point, either arrival or failure. Tires hissed on the street above the window. Somewhere nearby, an engine revved too hard, stalled, caught again. Through the narrow slice of basement glass, he saw only the lower halves of passing legs and the smeared reflection of red light on wet asphalt. But even that was enough to feel the city's posture changing. He muted all but one emergency audio channel and let the room settle around it. The next advisory came 21 minutes after the first, not from FEMA, but from the city health office, which still clung to phrases like a drowning man to office furniture. "This is a public health advisory for all residents of Aviary City. Current incidents involve acute fever, confusion, and in some cases, severe aggression. Avoid transporting ill family members without professional guidance. If a person becomes unresponsive and later violent, maintain distance and protect yourself from bodily fluids. Do not attempt mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in uncontrolled conditions. Await emergency direction where possible." Ed turned from the shelves slowly. "They said unresponsive and later violent." "Yes, which is close enough to telling the truth for government work. Only if we've lowered hell itself to a grading rubric." Barnes saved it anyway, adding a line in the comparison file. "City Health Advisory now acknowledges unresponsive to later violent sequence / still avoids death language." It was like watching an institution feel its way around a wound in the dark. Every update came closer to the thing while refusing to look at it directly. The public alert had admitted bites. The City Health Advisory had admitted violent change after apparent drop-off. Resuscitation was now specifically mentioned, which meant somebody, somewhere, had lost control of a room after trying to help a body that no longer fit any humane category. His future instinct sharpened. Not panic. Shape. Hospitals were already compromised. The first day of public honesty would not stabilize anything. It would send families into motion, push frightened people toward doors, flood clinics with the sick, and trap the worst cases in transit, hallways, stairwells, apartment lobbies, parking bays. A shelter-in-place order only worked when the city issuing it still had enough coherence to make staying put feel more rational than movement. Aviary City had passed that threshold hours ago. The order was late. The city knew it. The infected did not care. The thread had counted on exactly this span of institutional hesitation. Ed must have seen some of that in his face. "Talk," he said. Barnes rubbed the edge of the mug between thumb and forefinger. "They're issuing the right guidance to the wrong version of the city." Meaning? Meaning, if this alert had gone out 6 hours ago, maybe it slows the first wave. Maybe people keep Grandpa at home instead of dragging him through Mercy West. Maybe a school sends no one anywhere. Maybe triage doesn't become a feedlot. He gestured at the screen. Now? Half the people hearing this are already in motion. The other half are hearing 3 watered-down versions and 1 joke. Ed nodded. "So we don't move." Barnes looked at him. It was not fear in Ed's face, it was math. That helped. "No," Barnes said. "Not yet." "Why?" Because that was Ed too, not accepting instinct unless instinct came with inventory. Barnes answered in the only language Ed fully respected. "Filtered air, evidence custody, controlled entrances, sight lines, backup power, supplies we can still reach without exposure. Hallway camera, 2 exits if the first becomes fiction." Ed nodded once, satisfied not with safety. Neither of them were stupid enough to use that word honestly anymore, but with logic. "And the street," he said. "The street is where every wrong diagnosis goes to breed." "Good," Ed said. "Then we stay until staying becomes the dumber risk." That was almost elegant. "Don't spread it around." Barnes added one more line to the notes. Reason for holding basement, air filtration still functional, evidence already staged and preserved, controlled ingress points, hallway and exterior partial visibility. Unknown public compliance makes street exposure premature. He saved the file, mirrored it, and then did what his body had wanted to do since the first alert. He stood and went to the basement window. The street outside had turned theatrical in fragments. No full panorama, just cuts. A pair of boots running too fast and slipping. The flash of a flashlight beam skittering across wet concrete. The lower panel of a city bus stopped at a bad angle. Reflected emergency lights moving over pooled water like blood diluted in rain. Then the sound. Not the broad civic noise of a dense neighborhood, but concentrated episodes. Someone shouting a name, somebody else saying, "Don't touch him," with the kind of urgency that only existed after the world had changed faster than the sentence. Above and beyond, rotors hammered once through the cloud deck and moved east. When he turned back, Ed was checking the latch on the rear utility door. "You worried about the hallway," Barnes said. "I'm worried about doors," Ed replied. "Hallways just deliver them." "Fair." Barnes went back to the workstation and pulled the body cam fragment into the same pane as the public alert transcript. He watched the ambulance bay video one more time, the medic on the ground, the other backing away, the figure rising wrong, the camera swing, the scream, asphalt. Then he looked at the public wording. If a person becomes unresponsive and later violent, the state was translating images like that into procedural speech and pushing it out to people who had not yet accepted that death was no longer a stable line item. He typed beneath the comparison notes. Public language now reflects observed field behavior, but remains downstream from it. That sentence pleased him less than it should have. It meant he was still thinking like an investigator, while the city was becoming evidence around him. A message hit the phone, then another, then a stack of them, because once a system pushed an emergency alert, every local actor with a badge, a server, or an inferiority complex wanted their own version preserved in the bloodstream of the population. Transit authority, major route suspension, shelter in place, do not gather at stations, school district auto message, all facilities closed, students should remain with guardians and avoid outside travel. Hospital network public line. Emergency departments are overwhelmed. Do not present unless condition is critical. That one almost made Barnes laugh, not because it was false, because it was impossible. Tell a city not to go to the hospital during the first public acknowledgement of a contagious violent event and watch panic invent pilgrimage. He archived them all. On one low-trust local board, a user named Blockwife77 wrote, "They're telling us, don't go to the ER because the ER is where it happens." Barnes preserved that too. Ed came around to his side of the desk and looked at the growing capture pane. "You logging civilians now?" "I'm logging public interpretation. That what we're calling doom-scrolling in the apocalypse. That is a malicious reduction of my craft. It is also funny." He wasn't wrong. A burst of shouting above them cut the moment short. Both men froze, not far. On the block, one male voice, one female, then another voice too ragged to map. Something slammed against metal. Car door maybe, or dumpster. Then the short frantic slap of shoes on wet pavement and a child crying with the confused outrage children reserved for adults failing in public. Barnes moved to the window again. Couldn't see the source. Only the lower flare of brake lights in a hand, just a hand, braced against the side of a parked vehicle, then sliding down out of sight. Ed was beside him without seeming to cross the room. "You see? Not enough." The crying stopped. That was worse. A second later, a pair of legs sprinted past the window line, stumbled, recovered, vanished. Then a gunshot cracked somewhere farther up the street, sharp enough in the rain to flatten the whole block into listening silence. Ed drew back first. No patrol response. Barnes kept his eyes on the smear of reflected light outside. Maybe too busy. Maybe too dead. Maybe they heard that sentence before we did. He stepped back from the glass and logged the approximate time. Not because he could prove relevance, because once the city entered formal emergency posture, ambient violence itself became diagnostic. The hallway feed flickered once. Both men turned. For half a second, the image tore. Horizontal static band, digital smear, then recovery. Empty corridor. Same stain on the ceiling. Same cheap floor tile made ugly by fluorescent light. Ed stared at it. "That line's dirty. Building power's dirty," Barnes said. "Everything's dirty." "Still watching it?" "Yes." "Good." An hour passed in fragments. More advisories, more public confusion, more clipped traffic from emergency bands that had stopped trying to sound calm and started trying to sound useful. The phrase "shelter in place" repeated so often across channels that it began to lose semantic mass, becoming less instruction than background radiation. Barnes kept recording. He built timelines of the alert drift, federal first, then city health, then transit suspension, then hospital overflow notice, then school closure relay, then neighborhood copies, each one changing a noun, dropping a clause, sanding an edge. By the time some people heard the alert, it had become "stay inside and avoid sick people," a sentence so late and so incomplete it might as well have been carved into butter. He compared the wording to the thread. The thread remained quiet, which in itself had become a kind of speech. Whoever was behind it no longer needed to narrate every milestone. Public systems were doing the work for them now. The alert confirmed the lag. The watered-down relays confirmed the misclassification. The city's contradictory guidance confirmed what Sableglass and Null Harvest had treated like design parameters. Barnes's anger settled into something cleaner, not because rage was useful, because clarity sometimes arrived dressed as contempt. "They knew the public phase would look like this," he said aloud. Ed, checking batteries. "Who?" "The people in the thread, or whoever briefed them. Look at the sequence. First, private misread, then internal recognition, then delayed public admission, then diluted local copies. They modeled not just the spread, the explanation environment. He glanced at the notes. Sableglass practically told us. Ed slid a battery into the charger and watched the indicator blink red, meaning the outbreak's one weapon, and the city misunderstanding itself is another. That all. Barnes thought of the people dragging fevered relatives to intake points, school staff arguing over whether a kid had flu or psychosis, medics trying standard resuscitation on bodies no longer fit for standard anything. Transit shutting down after routing contagion through the exact corridors institutions had spent the morning trying not to name. "No," he said, "that's more than enough." The sat phone buzzed at 1417. Barnes caught it before the second vibration. "Go," said the voice on the other end. "Public alert is out," Barnes said. "Federal version includes bites and infectious exposure. City copies already stripping language." "We know." That sentence didn't sound reassuring. It wasn't meant to. Barnes pivoted slightly so Ed could hear. "What aren't they saying publicly?" he asked. A pause. Then, "They still haven't settled on death language." There it was, not surprise, confirmation. Of course they haven't. They've settled on fluid exposure risk, bite escalation, and non-responsiveness followed by violent activity. That's as far as they're willing to go in open channels. Because the next sentence ends the old world. The voice didn't answer. Which answered it? "What about movement controls?" Barnes asked. "Transit shutting down in bands, medical sectors being ringed unofficially, some blocks self-barricading. Nobody has enough personnel to make the map match the order." Barnes typed fast. "Formal emergency posture/practical fragmentation, public alert active, death language still suppressed, transit closures partial, medical ring containment uneven, neighborhood self-barricading emerging, enforcement insufficient for citywide control." Ed mouthed self-barricading and made a face like he'd just smelled a future problem. "What about Fed presence?" Barnes asked. "Light, coordinating more than moving, too little, too late." That also matched the weather. When the line ended, Barnes sat with the phone still in his hand for 2 seconds longer than necessary. Ed leaned against the shelf. "Self-barricading. That means people start treating apartment buildings like little countries." "Yes, that gets ugly quick." "It also means some will keep the infected inside because opening the door feels worse." Ed's expression went flat. "That's cheerful." "I'm diversifying." Outside, another helicopter passed lower than before, close enough to rattle something metallic in the ceiling and send a tremor through the basement pipes. The hallway light dimmed, recovered, dimmed again. Ed looked up. "Power." Barnes checked the inverter status. "Grid sag." "How long?" "No idea. Could stabilize. Could decide we've had enough civilization for one afternoon." "Battery reserve." "Still decent." "Good." He added it to the list anyway, because the room remained tactically useful precisely until its useful parts began lying. The next public feed to crack was the police department's emergency social account. It posted one message, then deleted it 40 seconds later. Barnes had it preserved before deletion because paranoia was finally receiving proper market validation. Officers responding to severe assaultive illness should avoid direct physical grappling and await backup with face and arm protection. Then, gone. The replacement message said only, "Residents should remain indoors and report emergencies when safe." Barnes held the two side by side on the screen. Ed saw them and barked a humorless laugh. They lost their nerve. "No," Barnes said. "They remembered their audience." The difference mattered. The deleted version told responders the truth. Do not grapple, protect the face and arms. The public version restored abstraction, residents, emergencies, when safe. Safe was a word governments used when they had outsourced specifics to your luck. Barnes archived both versions and tagged the deletion interval. The hallway feed showed movement. Both men reacted at once. Not a person. Light. A flashlight beam swept briefly across the far wall outside the basement corridor. Paused, then moved on. Too controlled for panic. Too low for a wandering resident checking breakers. Somebody in the building, using light carefully. Ed lifted one hand. Stillness. The beam returned 10 seconds later, shorter this time, sliding over the opposite wall and catching the edge of the basement stairwell before withdrawing. Barnes whispered, "Maintenance." Ed's face said no. "Tenant," Barnes tried. Ed's face said, still no. The corridor remained empty, but now the empty had been touched by intent. Barnes felt the room redraw itself again. The basement was still the correct choice. It was no longer anonymous. Ed moved to the weapons shelf, not hurried, not theatrical. Just one more variable becoming physical. "We're not moving because of a flashlight," Barnes said softly. "No." "We are logging it." "Yes." He did. Building interior anomaly. Controlled flashlight sweep outside basement corridor. 2 passes, no visible body. Then he glanced back at the hallway feed and hated that he had begun treating the corridor as another source needing chain of custody. The city by late afternoon had achieved the kind of false order disasters often wore in their most dangerous phase. Not stable, just newly categorized, official language out, public ritual beginning, some people barricading, some people running, some people deciding the warning itself was exaggeration because denial remained cheaper than adaptation until the exact second it killed you. Barnes saw all of that in the feeds. One board had users comparing taped-up apartment doors and discussing floor-by-floor watch rotations. Another had residents begging for entry to buildings already locked down. One grainy clip showed a convenience store stripped of bottled water and batteries, while 2 men in masks shouted at each other over bleach. Another showed an ambulance trying to reverse away from a crowd more desperate than violent, until somebody at the edge of the frame lunged wrong and the whole geometry changed. He preserved that one too, though the scream on the audio made Ed step away from the desk. "They still think this is a shortage problem," Barnes said. "Some of it is." "Yes," Barnes replied. "That's why it works so well." He meant the payload, or the event, or the city after. The names no longer mattered as much as the structure. Starve systems, delay recognition, make ordinary help dangerous, then let panic misallocate energy while the real transmission routes keep working. The body of the outbreak was biological. Its spine was civic. Ed came back with 2 additional magazines and set them on the table without comment. Barnes looked at them. "That encouraging?" "No." "Good. Just honest." By the time another broadcast cycle rolled through, the federal language had sharpened slightly and the local language had become more frightened. Federal update: do not perform unsupervised aid on unresponsive persons exhibiting fever or recent aggressive behavior. Local radio paraphrase: if someone drops and comes back violent, back away and wait. That paraphrase made Barnes close his eyes for a second, because there it was, the dead, almost named in public by people too exhausted to keep dressing the sentence up. He saved the audio. Ed said, "They're getting closer." Yes, to honesty. And to panic. Same distance. Barnes almost smiled. That was annoyingly elegant. "Learned from your decline." The basement lighting flickered again, longer this time. The second monitor went black for 1 heartbeat, came back with the image shifted, then settled. Ed looked at the inverter. "Still enough." "For now." There it was again. The phrase that had become the city's operating theology. For now. The hallway speaker crackled with another building advisory, someone on an upper floor shouting during it, doors closing, a child crying. Then the announcement itself, almost drowned in feedback. Remain in your units. Do not answer external knocking without verification. Shared stairwells may be restricted. Shared stairwells may be restricted. Barnes typed it down. Apartment blocks were becoming their own governments already. He thought of the flashlight beam outside the basement corridor and wondered whether the building was merely frightened or already evaluating who might be useful to exclude. Ed must have had some version of the same thought, because he said, "If they know we're stalked, it changes." "Yes, you think they know." "Not yet." Barnes looked toward the camera feed. But knowledge travels faster than honesty in buildings like this. He saved another backup of the evidence folders. The ritual calmed him in ugly little ways. Mirror the case archive. Verify hashes. Duplicate the map. Preserve the alert captures. Secure the thread screenshots. Label the audio clips. Build continuity while the world lost it. It was not hope. It was defiance wearing procedure. At 16:02, the hidden service thread updated once. Just once. Sable glass. Public phase established. Barnes stared at the screen. Ed read it over his shoulder and made a sound halfway between a grunt and a curse. "That's it. That's it. No celebration. No. No instructions. Don't need them." The phrase landed harder than the earlier public alert, because it translated the entire day into someone else's milestone. Not outbreak, not tragedy, not citywide emergency, public phase established. The kind of phrase you used when a rollout had entered the next stage and customer confusion was proceeding with intolerances. Barnes preserved the post and added it to the notes. Thread update confirms public alert phase treated as operational milestone. Then, beneath that, almost without intending to, he typed, "Institutions are finally speaking because the event no longer needs their silence to function." He read the sentence twice, left it. Outside, dusk began the slow, ugly work of making everything less legible. The basement window shifted from gray, wet afternoon to dark mirror with lights smeared across it. The hallway feed grew harsher as the fluorescent bulbs asserted themselves against encroaching shadow. Emergency lights reflected off the street at angles he could no longer easily parse. Sirens did not stop. They simply joined one another less often, which was somehow more sinister. A city reaching the point where its emergencies no longer fit easily into siren-shaped responses. Ed handed him a protein bar without warning. Barnes looked at it like it had committed a moral offense. "Nutrition first," Ed said. That line was already old when you used it the first time. Still true. Barnes unwrapped it and ate because he had enough self-knowledge to distrust any future built on low blood sugar and apocalyptic forensics. They didn't speak for a while. The room worked around them. Drives hummed. The battery indicator climbed and dipped. Rain softened, then thickened. Somewhere in the building above, something heavy was dragged across a floor. A door slammed. Another voice rose in argument and cut off too fast. Eventually, Barnes said, "We hold." Ed nodded once. "We hold." Not because the room was safe, because it still gave them more truth than the street would. Filtered air, controlled approaches, working storage, evidence intact. The hallway feed still functioned. The street outside could still be heard without yet demanding entry. They could watch the city enter formal emergency posture from a position that was neither blind nor mobile enough to be stupid. But the hold had changed nature. Before the FEMA alert, the basement had been a hidden place where two men studied the early geometry of disaster. After the alert, it had become a small fortified archive waiting for the larger city to decide whether archives counted as resources, targets, or witnesses. Barnes looked once more at the public message drift file. From silence to memo. From memo to internal guidance. From thread confidence to federal caution. From biting denied to biting admitted. From non-responsiveness to later violent. From denial to shelter in place. The institutions had arrived. The outbreak had been waiting for them. He glanced at the map on the wall, the eastward anomaly corridor still pinned there like a splintered prophecy. Sooner or later, movement would become the only honest choice. Not yet. For now, the basement remained the better lie. He saved everything again, and listened to the city through rain and speaker static and broken official language. It had entered formal emergency posture at last. Broadcasts said so, doors said so, transit said so, hospitals said so by begging people not to come near them. And still, beneath all of it, he could hear the delay, the lost morning, the corridor of misclassification, the hours when the thread had watched the city explain its own dying incorrectly. The alert had arrived with all the force of the state and none of the timing that might have redeemed it. Too late to prevent the first hospital collapses. Too late to stop families from carrying the wrong bodies to the wrong rooms. Too late to keep apartment blocks from becoming sealed little countries with sick people inside them. Too late to preserve the illusion that violence and infection still traveled separately. Barnes leaned back in the chair and let his eyes sting in the monitor light. Future instinct settled in him like cold metal. By morning, shelter would be less a command than a diagnosis. Some places would hold, others would become tombs with lease agreements. The city would still be issuing instructions. The event would still be obeying none of them. He looked at Ed. Ed was cleaning the flashlight lens again. The same ritual, same calm, same refusal to let fear become theatrics. "You still think we're right to stay?" Ed did not look up. "Yes. Even now. That alert doesn't make the street safer. It makes the street louder." Barnes considered that and nodded. Outside, somewhere beyond the line of municipal buildings and wet roads and failing language, another siren rose and did not finish. The basement hummed on. And the city, finally told to shelter in place, sounded like it had already missed its chance. Barnes did not open a new feed right away. He sat in the low light with the public alert transcripts, the municipal downgrades, the deleted police wording, the ambulance bay clip, and the thread captures spread across his screens like a civics lesson written by people who hated the public and feared the truth. For most of the afternoon, the question had been whether official language would catch up. Now the question was uglier. What exactly had it caught up to? He pulled the federal alert back beside the thread and read them line by line. Reports of extreme aggression, biting, and infectious exposure are under active review. Public phase established. The state had finally said bites. The operators had already moved on to milestones. That was the whole tragedy in miniature. Official language was not arriving early enough to shape the event. It was arriving late enough to confirm that the event no longer needed concealment to keep moving. Ed saw him looking between the two screens. "You've got the face again." Barnes rubbed a hand over his mouth. "I'm trying to decide whether the alert is meant to help or to document." "That's not a fun question." "No," Barnes said. "It's an accurate one." He opened a fresh note and typed without flourish. "The public alert is not intervention. It is admission." Then beneath it, "Institutions are finally speaking because silence has become less useful than warning." He read the lines once, left them. That was the seam he needed to preserve. The city had not been rescued by the alert. It had been formally informed of a collapse already well underway. The federal version acknowledged bites and infectious exposure because those things were now too visible to bury. The local copies immediately started sanding those truths back down because institutions still preferred survivable nouns to honest ones. The result was not clarity. It was authorized delay. Ed came around the desk and read over his shoulder. "Still behind." "Yes." "By how much?" Barnes looked toward the map wall. Mercy West, South Mercy, East Transfer, school closures, apartment blocks stiffening into barricade logic, transport corridors turning into exposure routes. "Enough to lose a city," he said. That sat between them in the way only simple sentences could. Outside, a vehicle screamed around a corner too fast, hydroplaned or nearly did, corrected, and kept going. A door slammed somewhere above. Then came 3 hard knocks on a different building entrance farther down the block, followed by the kind of silence people made when they were deciding whether compassion was still affordable. Barnes turned back to the workstation and began collapsing the chapter into sequence the way he always did when reality threatened to sprawl past usefulness. Private knowledge, memo, redactions, restricted guidance, hostile knowledge, thread, lag tracking, payload language, public acknowledgement, shelter in place, bytes admitted, contact risk implied, local distortion, municipal euphemism, deleted police specificity, repost mutation, lived consequence, hospitals amplifying, families self-transporting, buildings locking down, streets growing louder instead of safer. There, not 5 tracks, one mechanism. He titled the block, How the Warning Failed. Ed looked at the title and nodded once, not in approval, but in recognition. Barnes typed beneath it. The alert did not restore order. It formalized lateness. It did not create compliance. It multiplied interpretations. It did not make the street safer. It made the danger official. He saved the page, mirrored it, printed it, because by now paper had become an insult Barnes preferred to deliver in person. When the printer spat the sheet out with its usual offended delay, he pinned it beneath the others. Internal recognition delayed public recognition. Physical proof eliminated ordinary explanations. Containment is a lie. The public alert formalized lateness. He stepped back from the wall. The safe house now looked less like a room and more like a prosecution trying to teach itself patience. Ed watched him pin the page, then asked the only question that mattered. "We still hold?" Barnes looked at the hallway feed, the dim lights, the bags now pre-sorted for movement, the dark basement window reflecting emergency color in a city that had already started turning apartments into little border states. Then he looked at the evidence wall and the map rotting outward from medical corridors into everywhere else. "Yes," he said, "because the street is worse. And because once the warning goes public, the city gets louder before it gets smarter." "No," Barnes said softly. "That sounds like the next hour." He sat again, reopened the live case folder, and pulled in the latest mirrored hospital traffic. Mercy West had started dropping feeds in bursts. Parking structure, camera unstable. Internal corridors intermittent. Loading bay view frozen twice, then gone. A mirrored emergency management cache caught a few frames before the system failed completely. Staff density increasing, improvised barricade shape, vehicle congestion where there should have been none. Hospitals are no longer control points, he thought. They are pressure vessels. He didn't write that one down yet, didn't need to, because he could already feel the next chapter assembling itself from the parts on his screens. The hospital becoming public failure in real time, the warning too late to prevent crowd geometry from becoming byte geometry. The city, learning that containment had been a word spoken by people not yet standing in the garage. He clicked open the mirrored Mercy West file and let the first frozen frame load. Then he said, without taking his eyes off the screen, "There it is." Ed came to stand behind him. On the monitor, the hospital parking garage ramp waited in grayscale and rain sheen, full of vehicles that should have been moving and people who had already run out of better categories. Containment, Barnes thought, had just reached the phase where everyone could see it fail.